Hello, this is Mrs. Boots. We're going to go through the practice problems for Complete the Square. Remember, the Complete the Square method is another method to solve a quadratic. When we use the Complete the Square, just like with any of the other methods, we want to make sure that our quadratic is equal to 0 at first. It really doesn't matter with this one, because we add blanks to both sides. Do you remember what goes in the blank? B divided by 2 squared. So we want to use the Complete the Square method if B is even. If B is not even, then we really don't want to use this particular method because it will be more difficult. Let's look at the problems. Number 1. Our quadratic is equal to 0, so we could use quadratic formula or factor. In this case, we're going to use Complete the Square, which means we actually move the 8 to the other side. That leaves us space for our new constant that we're going to plug in. When we move the 8, it becomes positive. Now we add in the blanks. Plus blank on both sides. What goes in the blank? B divided by 2 squared. So I have 12 divided by 2, which is 6. 6 squared is 36. So I have a 36 on both sides. Now we need to write the binomial squared. What number did we square? We squared a 6. Make sure you take the sign of the middle term. So it's x minus 6 squared equals, now what is 8 plus 36? Well, that's 44. Now we're going to solve. How do you get rid of a square? What do? You take the square root. So we take the square root of both sides. Remember, there's a plus minus. There's always a plus minus in front of the square root. So on the left, the square and the square root cancel, and I'm left with x minus 6, just the stuff inside. On the right, I have plus or minus the square root of 44. Can we simplify the square root of 44? Well, 44 is 4 times 11. The square root of 4 is 2. So on the left, this becomes 2 square root 11. But we still need to move the 6 over. So we would add 6 to both sides. So I get x equals 6 plus or minus the square root 2 square root of 11. If we had used the quadratic formula, we would have gotten the exact same answer. Number 2, x squared minus 6x minus 7. Move the negative 7. We don't need it. So I've got x squared minus 6x. I'm going to leave a space. The negative 7 becomes positive. In my space, I put my blanks. That's where my b divided by 2 squared is going to go. So I take my b, which is 6, divided by 2 is 3. Square that. 9. 9 on both sides. Remember, what you do to one side, you must do to the other. Now we can write our binomial. So I have x. What did I square? A 3. And I get the sign of the middle. Negative. So it's x minus 3 quantity squared. Oh, that should be a plus. My bad. Now 7 plus 9 is 16. Now we take the square root of both sides. Remember, when you take the square root, you have to put in a plus minus on the left side. Square and square root cancel, leaves me with x plus 3. It's equal to plus or minus, what's the square root of 16? 4. So plus or minus 4. When I move my 3 over to solve for x, I've got x equals negative 3 plus or minus 4. Remember, just like with quadratic formula, we split it into two cases. I have negative 3 plus 4, and I have negative 3 minus 4. Negative 3 plus 4 is positive 1, so that's one of my roots, and negative 3 minus 4 is negative 7. That's the other root. Number 3. My equation's equal to 0, but I have to move the constant because I'm not going to use it. So I have x squared minus 2x. I leave a space for my blank. Negative 1 when moved over becomes positive 1. Now add the blanks. Plus blank to both sides. What goes in the blank? B divided by 2 squared. B is negative 2. Divided by 2 is negative 1. Square it and I get positive 1. Now, but we just moved a 1. Notice the signs are different. It has to have the exact same sign. Okay, it has to be positive in order to do the squares. So, we're going to write our binomial. What was it we squared? We squared a 1. So I have an x and a 1. What's the sign? The middle. Negative. That equals to 1 plus 1, which is 2. So if x minus 1 quantity squared equals to 2. Now to solve, I have to get rid of my square root. I have to get rid of my square. So I'm going to take the square root. I got a step ahead. I have a plus minus that always goes on the right. Square and the square root cancel, leaving me with the stuff inside the parentheses. X minus 1. That's going to equal to plus or minus the square root of 2. Can I take the square root of 2? No. So to solve for x, I just move my negative 1 over by adding 1. So x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. We would get the exact same answer if we'd used the quadratic formula. This is just a shortcut. Number 4. Well, I've got a 1 there for a constant that I don't need, so I'm going to move it to the other side. So I have x squared plus 4x, and I'm going to leave space. The positive 1, to move it to the other side, I would subtract it. So it becomes minus 1. Now we put the blanks on both sides. Plus blank, plus blank. What number goes in the blank? B divided by 2 squared. So 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. So I put a 4 in the blank on both sides. Now I need to write my binomial squared. What was it I squared to get that 4? I squared a 2. So I have x and a 2, and I use the sign of the middle term, which is a plus. So it becomes x plus 2 quantity squared. If I were to factor my trinomial, x squared plus 4x plus 4, I would get x plus 2 times x plus 2. On the other side, negative 1 plus 4 is 3. Now I can solve. To get rid of a square, we take the square root. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So you take the square root of both sides. Also remember the plus minus. The square and square root cancel. We're left with just x plus 2 on the left. Equals plus or minus the square root of 3. Can you take the square root of 3? No. Can we simplify it? No. So we're going to move the 2 over so we can solve for x. So x equals negative 2. Because it was positive, we subtract it to move it over. Plus or minus the square root of 3. If we wanted to approximate, we could plug it into the calculator and do 2 plus the square root of 3 and negative 2 minus the square root of 3. Number 5. First step, move your constant. We're not going to use it. We're going to use our own constant that gives us that perfect square. So I have x squared minus 4x, and I leave space. When the negative 2 moves over, it becomes positive. Now I can add my blanks in. Plus blank, plus blank. What goes in the blank? I take b, which is 4, divide it by 2, and square it. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 2 squared is 4. Didn't we just do that? Yes, we did. I'm being silly. Okay, so now I'm going to write my binomial squared. X is in the front. What did I just square? 4 divided by 2 is 2. That's what I squared. The sign of the middle is what we use. Now, on the other side of the equation, 2 plus 4 is 6. So I have x minus 2 quantity squared equals 6. To solve it, I use what to get rid of the square? That's correct. I use a square root. I remember that one side has to have the plus minus. Square and square root cancel, leaves me with x minus 2. And on the other side, I have plus or minus the square root of 6. Can I take the square root of 6? No. Can I simplify it? No. So, I'm going to just get x by itself. So I move that negative 2 to the other side. I have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 6. If we wanted to get an approximation, we could plug it in and get the decimal values. That way we could graph it. Number 6. We have a quadratic equal to 0. We want to move the constant over to leave room for our new constant. So I have x squared minus 20x. Leave a space. Negative 2 moved to the other side becomes positive 2. Now I can add my blanks. Plus blank, plus blank. What goes in the blank? Well, I have to use b. b is 20. 20 divided by 2 and then squared. What is 20 divided by 2? 10. 10 squared is 100. It's a bigger number, but we can survive. So, I have 100 on both sides. Now I can write my binomial. Parentheses squared. X is in the front. What did we square? We squared 10. We use the sign of the middle, minus. 2 plus 100 gives us 102 on the right-hand side. Now, I have something squared. To get rid of the square, I take the square root. Always use the plus minus. Square and square root cancel, leaving the stuff inside. X minus 10. Plus or minus square root of 102. Can we simplify 102? Well, that's 2 times 51. Last time I checked, neither of those are perfect squares, and 51's prime, which means it doesn't break down any further. So we're going to leave it the way it is. That means I just need to move my negative 10 over. So I add 10 to both sides. So I have positive 10 plus or minus the square root of 102. This would be the solution for number 6. Number 7. Move the constant. That's the very first thing. Make sure it's on the other side. What's left? X squared plus 14x with a space. I leave the space because I want to put my new constant in there. Positive 1 moved to the other side becomes negative 1. Now I can add my blanks. Plus blank, plus blank. What is going to go in the blank? B divided by 2 squared. What is 14 divided by 2? 7. 7 squared is 49. So I have 49 on both sides. Remember to always do the same thing to both sides of the equation. Now I can take my trinomial and write it as a binomial squared. X's go in front. What did we square? We squared 7. The sign of the middle is positive, so it's x plus 7 squared equals 49 minus 1 is 48. So I have a quantity squared equals a number. To get rid of the square, we take the square root. Remember the plus minus. Now, square and square root cancel. That leaves me with x plus 7. That's equal to plus or minus the square root of 48. Can I take the square root of 48? No, cannot take the square root of 48, but I can simplify. Remember, 48 is 3 times 16, and 16 The square root of it is 4. So I have x plus 7 equals plus or minus 4 square root of 3. Now, let's solve for x. We need to move the 7 over. How do we do that? It's a positive 7, so we have to subtract. So I get x equals negative 7 plus or minus 4 square root of 3. This is our answer. This is the completely square for number 7. Number 8. First thing, move the constant over. We're not going to use it. We're going to use our own. So I get x squared minus 16x. Leave space. Negative 2 moved to the other side is positive 2. Add your blanks. Plus blank, plus blank. What's going to go in the blank? B divided by 2 squared. So 16 divided by 2 squared. What is 16 divided by 2? 8. 8 squared is 64. So add 64 to both sides. Remember, always do the same thing on both sides. Now, I'm going to take my trinomial and write it as a binomial squared. X is in front. What did we square? We squared 8. The middle is the sign that we use. So I have x minus 8 quantity squared. That's equal to 66. Now I can take the square root of both sides to solve. Square root, remember the plus minus. Square and square root cancel. That leaves me with just x minus 8. On the other side I have plus or minus the square root of 66. Can I take the square root of 66? No. Can I break it down? Well, 66 is 6 times 11. That's not going to help me any. So I'm going to leave it alone. Now let's solve for x. That's my last step. I need to move that negative 8 over. Negative 8, when it's moved to the other side, becomes positive 8. So I have 8 plus the square root of 66. These would be my roots or my solutions. If I plugged it into the calculator, I could get approximated decimal values that I could then put on the graph. Number 9. Start the same way. We want to move the constant. So I have x squared plus 3x. Leave space. The negative 2 becomes a positive 2. We add blanks. Plus blank, plus blank. Now what number is going to go in the blank? I take b, which is 3. Divide it by 2, and then square it. Now you're seeing why we don't use complete the square with odd numbers for b. But I want to work through this problem so you can see how crazy it gets. So 1.5 squared is 2.25. Some teachers prefer that you leave it in fractions. It's up to you. Remember, we need to write this as our binomial squared. So I have my parentheses squared. X is at the front. The sign's the same as b. What did we square? We squared 1.5. Now what is 2 plus 2.25? 4.25. Okay. Now, just like before, we got to get rid of the square, so we take the square root of both sides. You still have a plus minus. The steps don't change. The numbers are a little crazy, but the steps don't change. The square and the square root cancel. You get x plus 1.5 equals plus or minus the square root of 4.25. 4.25, you could take a square root and get a decimal, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to solve for x by moving the 1.5 to the other side. When we move it, we get a negative 1.5 plus or minus the square root of 4.25. Since we already have decimals, yes, I would plug it in and approximate it. This concludes the practice problems for the completing the square lesson.